Tonight, Moscow is pushing back hard after a report said U.S. intelligence still sees President Vladimir Putin aiming far beyond today's front lines in Ukraine. The Kremlin calls that assessment false, and the timing matters because U.S., European, Ukrainian, and Russian officials are trading proposals for a possible settlement now. At the center is a basic question with enormous consequences. Is Russia trying to end this war, or trying to reset Europe's borders again by force? U.S. officials say negotiations have made progress, yet intelligence briefings described by Reuters suggest Moscow's ambitions remain maximal, even if its capacity is limited today. Russia's denial and Washington's own mixed messaging are feeding a high-stakes debate about what peace would actually mean and what risks it leaves behind. According to Reuters, 6 people familiar with U.S. intelligence said recent assessments still warn Putin wants to capture all of Ukraine, not just parts there. The same sources said U.S. analysts also believe he covets territory in Europe, once inside the Soviet Empire, including former Soviet bloc states as well. One person cited in that report said the most recent intelligence document was dated late September, even as diplomacy accelerated into the open this winter. The intelligence picture, Reuters said, differs from comments by President Donald Trump's envoys, who have argued Putin is ready to end the conflict soon enough. In Washington, those assessments are being read not as a forecast of immediate invasion, but as a warning about intentions over time and future leverage. On December 22, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters the U.S. intelligence conclusions were, in his words, absolutely not true about Putin's aims in Europe. He said Moscow could not judge the reliability of unnamed sources, but insisted that any claim of plans to seize all Ukraine is wrong too. Peskov's response follows Putin's repeated public line that Russia does not seek to restore the Soviet Union or attack a NATO member state at all. At the same time, the Kremlin again pointed to NATO eastward expansion as a security threat, a grievance Moscow has emphasized for decades now openly. And Putin has warned that if Europe ever started a war with Russia, Moscow believes it would prevail, a claim Europeans reject as dangerous rhetoric. This dispute lands in the middle of active diplomacy, where perceptions can be as important as troop movements on the ground right now for talks. In the same Reuters reporting, lawmakers and European officials were described as largely aligned with the view that Putin ultimately wants more territory still ahead. Congressman Mike Quigley, who sits on the House Intelligence Committee, told Reuters that the intelligence has always been, in effect, that Putin wants more anyway. He said many Europeans, especially in Poland and the Baltic states, are convinced they could be next if Russia succeeds in Ukraine militarily and politically. Those fears are a key reason why any peace plan is being judged, and not only by where lines stop, but by whether deterrence holds afterward. Complicating the picture, U.S. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard posted on X that Russia seeks to avoid a larger war with Europe for now. She said intelligence officers have briefed lawmakers that Russia's battlefield performance shows it lacks the capacity to overrun all of Ukraine, let alone Europe today. In other words, she emphasized capability rather than intent, and framed warnings about wider conquest as an attempt to undermine President Trump's peace push publicly. Her message does not erase the Reuters report, but it highlights a real split between intelligence professionals, political appointees, and negotiators inside Washington right now. For allies watching from Europe, that split matters because security guarantees depend on what the United States is willing to sign, fund, and defend later. The facts on the map are clear. Russia invaded in February 2022, and its forces now control about a fifth of Ukraine, nearly 4 years. That includes Crimea, annexed in 2014, and large parts of the eastern Donbas, plus areas of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, according to Ukrainian and Western estimates. Putin claims Crimea and 4 Ukrainian provinces as Russian territory, while Ukraine says those annexations are illegal and that its borders must be restored fully. In Reuters reporting, 2 sources familiar with talks said the United States has pressed Kyiv to withdraw from the part of Donetsk it still holds. Zelensky and many Ukrainians have rejected ceding territory outright, arguing that concessions without strong guarantees could invite another attack later, even if fighting pauses briefly. The peace effort now running through Washington has a distinct cast, with Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and envoy Steve Witkoff leading talks abroad. Zelensky says negotiators have been working on a 20-point plan presented by U.S. envoys, after earlier drafts drew criticism as too favorable to Moscow overall. Over the weekend of December 20 and 21, U.S. officials held meetings in Miami with Ukrainian and European delegations, while meeting Russian representatives in Florida. Reuters reported that the Russian side included Kirill Dmitriev, an investment envoy who also runs Russia's wealth fund, underscoring how economic issues shadow the talks. U.S. officials have described the discussions as productive, but Moscow's spokesman told a Russian newspaper they should not be mistaken for a breakthrough just yet. In remarks published by Izvestia, Peskov called the Miami meetings a working process and said further discussions would continue in meticulous, expert-level format from here. He said Russia wants details of Washington's work with Europe and Ukraine. Then we'll judge whether proposals match what he called the spirit of Anchorage. That refers to an August meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, where Trump and Putin discussed possible parameters for ending the war, including territory and security guarantees. Both sides agreed at that time to keep channels open and let experts keep talking, an approach designed to prevent misunderstandings from spiraling out fast. Yet even with channels open, distrust is, and that is why a fight over intelligence assessments is not a side story but a central one. In parallel with Miami, Reuters reported that U.S., Ukrainian, and European negotiators reached broad agreement in Berlin on strong U.S.-backed security guarantees for Ukraine soon. Diplomats described a European security force deployed in neighboring countries and in Ukraine away from the front lines to help repel any future Russian attack. Those diplomats said the United States would provide intelligence and support, and that the package would be ratified by the U.S. Senate, giving it weight. Two sources familiar with the talks told Reuters the plan could also include U.S.-backed air patrols over Ukraine after a peace agreement is signed formally. One source said Ukraine's military would be capped at 800,000 troops, though several diplomats said Russia wants a lower cap and Americans may listen too. Zelensky has welcomed movement, but he has also asked a blunt question. What will these guarantees actually do if Russia attacks again later in practice? In Kiev's view, a ceasefire that simply freezes lines would be dangerous because it could allow Russia to regroup, rearm, and return at a time. Zelensky told Ukrainian diplomats that talks with the United States and Europe are very close to a real result, even if not ideal for everyone. He said the basic block of documents is ready, but there are matters Ukraine is not prepared for, and he believes Russia has limits too. Later, he said the key is whether Washington can get a response from Moscow that shows readiness to focus on something other than aggression now. So what is really being argued here is not a single sentence in a briefing, but the strategic story behind the war itself today globally. If intelligence agencies believe Russia's leadership seeks to dominate all Ukraine, then any deal leaving a weakened Ukraine could be only a pause in war. But if the Kremlin is telling the truth about limited aims, then the focus shifts to how to lock in a settlement and prevent escalation. Either way, both sides know that words about intent can move markets, shift alliances, and influence whether Europe spends more on defense next year too. That is why Moscow's rapid denial is designed not just for Americans, but for Europeans, Ukrainians, and a Russian public tired of war as well. Publicly, Russia frames the conflict as a fight over security and identity, insisting NATO expansion threatens its safety and that Ukraine should be neutral permanently. Russian officials often speak of addressing root causes, a phrase that typically includes rolling back Western military presence near Russia and changing Ukraine's political orientation. Ukraine and its partners hear that language differently, as a demand to limit Ukrainian sovereignty and as a warning that Moscow reserves a veto forever. This gap is why intelligence assessments about ultimate aims resonate. They either confirm the worst fears or challenge them at the most delicate moment possible. In negotiations, each side also tries to shape the narrative because perception can decide who is blamed for failure and who wins support abroad today. The clash between the Reuters report and Gabbard's post also points to a classic intelligence dilemma. Intent can outlast capability and vice versa in history. A state may lack the forces to take territory today, yet still plan for a future opportunity, especially if it believes its adversaries are divided. Conversely, leaders may scale back ambitions if costs rise, if elites push for stability, or if security guarantees change the calculus over months and years. Intelligence assessments often try to capture both, describing what a leader wants and what the state can do, but those judgments can change quietly fast. For audiences, the simplest takeaway is that different officials are emphasizing different halves of the same question, while negotiations demand one clear answer from Washington. Reuters said the U.S. intelligence view largely aligns with assessments shared by British and other European security services, and that matters in NATO planning cycle. Across the alliance, officials have warned that even if the fighting slows, Russia could rebuild forces, learn lessons, and posture for new pressure later again. Those warnings are reinforced by hybrid incidents, from sabotage fears to cyber attacks, which European governments often attribute to Moscow or pro-Russian groups operating inside borders. Russia routinely denies such accusations and says the West exaggerates threats to justify military spending, basing decisions on propaganda rather than evidence it calls fiction. The result is a trust gap so wide that every new report, every denial, and every leaked assessment becomes another test of credibility for leaders. Putin's own statements add fuel to the argument because he has sometimes framed Ukraine as part of a historical Russia, while insisting he seeks peace. In December, he said Russian forces would take more territory if Kyiv refuses to cede remaining parts of the Donbas that Ukraine still controls there. And he also said at his year-end appearance that Russia does not want a war with Europe, yet he coupled that with warnings about victory anyway. Okay? And in the Reuters report, Putin said his forces advanced 6,000 square kilometers this year, a claim used to argue he has leverage at talks. When leaders talk like that, analysts ask whether the public line is a ceiling, a floor, or simply another negotiating tactic for this moment only. The more negotiators believe Russia may return for more, the more they insist on guarantees that work without immediate NATO membership, yet still deter attack. That is why proposals now include foreign forces positioned away from the front, layered air defense, intelligence sharing, and rapid support arrangements for Ukraine alone. Yet each element raises questions from who commands the force to what rules of engagement apply to whether parliaments will approve deployments in peacetime first. Russia has repeatedly rejected the idea of foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, calling such plans unacceptable, which could turn a guarantee into a new flashpoint. So the debate about wider aims is also a debate about how much risk Europe is prepared to absorb and how much deterrence costs today. Economics is woven through this because sanctions, frozen Russian assets, and oil revenues are part of the leverage each side brings to the table now. Zelensky has argued that continuing pressure on the Kremlin, including measures that lower Russia's income, is essential to persuade Moscow to stop fighting for good. Russian officials respond that sanctions are economic warfare, and they insist any settlement must address what they call the roots of the conflict first, too. Meanwhile, investors, energy markets, and defense industries track every shift in rhetoric because the war has reshaped supply chains and government budgets worldwide since 2022. When Moscow denies wider aims, it is also trying to counter arguments for tighter sanctions and bigger military aid. Especially in European capitals this winter, inside Ukraine, any deal faces intense scrutiny from citizens who have lived through invasion, occupation, and repeated missile attacks on cities and power systems again. A Russian air attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure this week killed at least 3 people. And caused outages, according to Ukrainian officials cited by Reuters. Such strikes make it harder for leaders in Kyiv to sell compromises because the public hears the blasts and asks what peace would change soon. In Russia, war fatigue and economic strain have grown, yet the state still frames the campaign as necessary, and it punishes dissent harshly at times. So when Peskov dismisses wider ambitions, he is also speaking to Russians who want reassurance that the conflict will not expand into Europe ever again. In the United States, Trump has argued that he can end the war through engagement, and his team portrays the talks as closer than ever. A White House official told Reuters the team has made tremendous progress and that a deal is closer, but did not address the intelligence warning. Critics argue that rushing toward peace could reward aggression, while supporters say ending the bloodshed is urgent and that diplomacy is the only path left. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he does not know if Putin wants a deal or wants all Ukraine, pointing to Putin's own words publicly. In that environment, an intelligence report suggesting maximal aims becomes political ammunition, and Moscow's denial becomes part of the U.S. argument over strategy and cost. From Moscow's perspective, rejecting the claim of wider aims serves several purposes, starting with reducing the justification for NATO buildup along Russia's borders right now. If Europeans believe Russia wants to reclaim former Soviet space, they are more likely to send weapons, harden defenses, and accept the costs of sanctions. Denying that ambition also aims to divide Western publics by portraying fears as hysteria and the war as a localized dispute that can be managed. It helps Moscow argue that security guarantees involving foreign forces are unnecessary provocation, and that Ukraine should instead accept neutrality and territorial concessions soon enough. And it offers a talking point for countries outside Europe, many of which want the war to end but do not want a wider confrontation. Still, intelligence reporting is rarely simple, and even the Reuters account is built on unnamed sources, which means outside audiences cannot see the evidence directly. That does not make it untrue, but it does require careful language. It is being reported that the assessments point to wider ambitions for Putin. Intelligence agencies may also hedge, presenting worst-case scenarios so leaders are not surprised, while diplomats may present best-case scenarios to keep talks alive. When those two mindsets collide in public, the result can look like contradiction, even if both are describing different time horizons for risk and hope. For Russia's neighbors, the safest approach is to assume the threat is real until proven otherwise, and to demand guarantees that can be enforced rapidly. What might enforcement look like? In practical terms, if a ceasefire is reached and Russia later tests the boundary with drones or artillery again anyway, would European forces respond? And if so, how quickly? And under what authority? And with what U.S. support in intelligence, air power, and logistics plans? These questions are why diplomats say they are working on Senate ratification, because a treaty-like commitment could survive elections and reduce uncertainty for Ukraine too. But ratification is politically difficult, and European troop deployments are controversial at home, meaning promises can be drafted on paper yet weakened in reality later. That gap between paper and practice is exactly what Ukraine fears, and exactly what Russian strategists might probe if they decide the moment is right. Territory is the other hard knot, because lines drawn by force create legal disputes that can last generations, and because people live under occupation still. A deal that leaves Russia in control of seized areas might stop the shooting, but it could also normalize annexation and encourage future land grabs. Yet a deal that demands full Russian withdrawal may be militarily unreachable today and could prolong a war that has already devastated communities across Ukraine. This is where intelligence assessments become a compass. If Russia's aim is larger than its current holdings, then territorial compromise may not buy peace either. But if Russia mainly wants recognition of what it already controls, then a settlement, backed by hard guarantees, might hold longer than many fear today. Beyond Ukraine, the dispute touches Europe's wider security order, including nuclear risk, conventional force posture, and the future of arms control talks with Russia again. European leaders want to avoid a direct Russia-NATO war, but they also fear that accepting aggression would weaken the credibility of their deterrent system. For Moscow, Raising fears about NATO expansion is a way to justify its actions at home and to argue that it is responding defensively only. For Washington, balancing support for Ukraine with the desire to end the war has created pressure to test compromises, even when allies are uneasy inside. And for intelligence agencies, the challenge is to warn about long-term ambitions without accidentally derailing talks that might stop the killing this month or next. We are watching, in real time, an information contest layered on top of a shooting war, where each side tries to define what is true. The West points to Russia's past actions in Georgia and Ukraine, and to annexations as evidence that borders are being revised by force again today. Russia points to NATO enlargement, Western military aid, and what it calls broken promises to claim that it is defending itself from encirclement for years. Because both narratives contain selective facts, viewers are left trying to separate capability from intent, propaganda from analysis, and bargaining from belief each single day. That is why a simple denial from the Kremlin or a single intelligence leak rarely settles the argument, but it can shift the negotiation mood. So what should audiences watch next, beyond the statements, to judge whether Russia's aims are narrowing or widening as diplomacy moves forward from this point? One indicator is Russia's force posture, including mobilization policies, weapons production, and deployments near NATO borders, all of which signal preparation for future moves too. Another is the language in any draft documents, especially how territory is described, how guarantees are triggered, and what verification mechanisms are included for violations. Watch also for whether attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure continue during talks, because sustained strikes can imply coercion rather than compromise as a bargaining tool now. And pay attention to Europe's unity. If allies agree on troop deployments and funding, Russia may see less opportunity to exploit divisions among them again. In the coming days, officials are expected to continue technical discussions, and Kiev says draft documents are already prepared on guarantees, recovery, and a framework. Russia says the process is and not a breakthrough, but it is seeking clarity on what Washington and Europe are offering and what Ukraine can see. The United States is weighing how to balance support for Ukraine with limits Russia demands on Ukraine's military, an issue that could decide acceptance later. Meanwhile, the intelligence debate will continue because it shapes how any ceasefire is sold to lawmakers, to voters, and to allied capitals around the world. And the Kremlin will keep insisting it has no wider aim, even as critics point to history and to Russia's words as reasons for skepticism. For now, the confirmed fact is this: the Kremlin has rejected the reported U.S. intelligence view that Putin wants all Ukraine and parts of Europe. What remains contested is motivation, and that contest is unfolding as negotiators draft guarantees, debate territory, and try to decide whether trust can be built. If Moscow's denial is accurate, the path to a deal may depend on technical details and political courage, not on preparing for a wider war. If the intelligence warnings are closer to reality, then the debate is about deterrence after any ceasefire and about ensuring Ukraine cannot be coerced again. Either way, the moves in Miami, Berlin, and Moscow will show whether this denial is the start of compromise or another line in the fight.